every sense of the word. She was his sounding board, and she was his rock and his trusted advisor, and she held a deep moral compass, a profound understanding of how life should be. When her husband was elected Georgia in the 1970s, one of the first things that she did as an official act as the First Lady of Georgia was to visit a women's penitentiary. She was appalled at the conditions she found there and set about doing what she could to improve them. Her public life was a model of generosity and compassion for those whom the world treated unfairly. Born in 1927 in Georgia, the eldest of 4 children, her mother was a teacher and a dressmaker and worked at the post office. Her father was a mechanic and a bus driver and a farmer. Like so many families during that time, they lived in poverty. But growing up during the Depression meant that nobody had any money, so they didn't know that they were poor. They were just like everybody else. She was a very smart child by all accounts, succeeding in school, graduating at the head of her class from Plains High School, and then graduating from Georgia Southwest College in 1946. She married Jimmy Carter in 1946, in July, just after she graduated, and in doing so, she set aside her previous plans to attend Georgia State College for Women to pursue a career in design. She had dreamed of being an architect, but she loved this young naval officer so much that she married him. They had 4 children, 3 boys in relatively quick succession, and then Amy some years later in 1967. Now, women of her age and social status were expected to comply with a certain model of behavior. As a married woman, she was expected to raise her children and keep her home, and if her husband provided sufficiently that they could afford it, she could devote her passions and her energy not toward a career, but toward charitable works. Rosalind Carter's professional and public life was a model of generosity, humility, and fierce advocacy for those living with and deeply challenged by mental illness. In Georgia, while her husband served in first the state legislature and then the governor's mansion, Mrs. Carter focused her attention on the care and treatment, or rather mistreatment, of those living with mental illness in Georgia and beyond. She was a leading supporter, think about this, in the 1960s and early 70s, of the Special Olympics, and worked tirelessly to normalize mental health treatment and remove the stigma associated with seeking care. Here's an interesting little piece of history. During the time when her husband was governor of Georgia, there was a prison work program, which is a euphemism for unpaid slave labor of incarcerated people. One of the jobs that prisoners could get was to work in the governor's mansion as a cook or a housekeeper, or groundskeeper, or in one case, as the nanny for the governor's children. Mary Prince was a Black woman who had been wrongfully convicted of murder and one of the people who worked in the governor's mansion with the Carters. She served as little Amy's caregiver. Convicted murderer, penniless Black woman, was entrusted with the toddler of the governors and his wife. They believed in her. They believed in her innocence. And so they trusted Amy to her care, and Amy adored her. As part of her work with women in the prison system, Rosalind learned about the unfair treatment that defendants endured from lawyers who promised them release or parole in exchange for money for filing ridiculous motions that were bound to go nowhere. But it was the way lawyers made money off of the family and incarcerated people. When they left the governor's mansion, Mary Prince went back to prison because her position had been with that governor, and the next governor chose his own staff. Some years later, when Jimmy Carter was elected to the presidency, 1976, the Carters worked to secure Mary Prince's parole into their care, with the president serving as her parole officer. They brought her with them to the White House to care for Amy, and they worked for years to clear Mary Prince's name and get her wrongful conviction dismissed. Mary Prince remained with the Carters for decades, working as an integral part of the family structure. The former president dedicated his 2004 book, Sharing Good Times, to Mary Prince, writing, "Whom we love and cherish." We see in the Carters, and this morning, particularly in Rosalind Carter's lifetime, a lifetime of work for charitable causes. Now, for her, that was the expected role of a married woman in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Her role as spouse of a political leader elevated her efforts to the public, bringing attention, some good, some bad, to the work she supported. Mrs. Carter could have devoted herself to non-controversial efforts. Lady Bird Johnson spent her attention trying to beautify the highways of America by seeding highway median strips with wildflowers. Lovely, lovely work, very important, and not so controversial. But Mrs. Carter devoted her time in supporting those who were most harshly treated by the systems and governments that purported to protect and serve them. Those with mental illnesses and disabilities, and those who were cheated and abused by criminal defense lawyers while they were incarcerated. Mrs. Carter was a model of what it takes to engage in a lifetime of spiritual generosity. She opened up her heart and her family to absorb the stories of real people who were suffering, and sought to ease that suffering in whatever way she could. She leveraged her public position as the wife of a state politician, then governor, then first lady, to achieve things she might not have been able to manage were it not for the pressure her position could bring to bear. Corrupt officials have no trouble tossing reporters, protesters, and other complainants out of their offices, but when the first lady comes calling, that's a different sort of thing. I cannot imagine they liked it one bit. But Mrs. Carter was undaunted by any negative comments aimed in her direction, and she exposed the injustices in the system. A system, it should be acknowledged, that her husband had been elected to lead, and he supported her in these efforts. And we have all heard these stories in the past week as America mourns this national treasure. And as a minister, it causes me to view the life of this remarkable woman as that of a deeply committed person of faith. A lifelong Baptist, she was an elected deacon in the family church in Plains, Georgia, before the family parted ways very publicly with that church over the Southern Baptist Convention's refusal to ordain women and to treat them as equals to men. Rosalind and Jimmy were known to read Bible passages to each other in Spanish before bedtime in the evenings, late into their years. This is a woman who believed in Jesus of Nazareth and his instructions to serve others humbly, without drawing fanfare and attention to herself. Together, she and her husband approached life as an opportunity to serve. That takes a deep personal commitment to generosity. Growing up in rural Georgia, I haven't spoken publicly in a couple of weeks. But growing up in rural Georgia in the 1930s, in the Depression, Rosalind's family was poor. But everyone was poor in 1930s. And lacking any reference, she and so many others like her neighbors thought they were okay. When neighbors were in need, you helped them out. When you were short on flour for bread, neighbors would share their own. That's just how neighborly relations worked. That's how a Christian understanding of community worked. You share. And what you share what you have, even when what you have does not feel like it's quite enough. The gospel story of the multiplying loaves and fishes was not a lofty or magical myth to these folks. They saw it played out every day, all around them. Everyone is living lean, but when your neighbor's hungry, you share what you've got, and everybody gets to eat. For Rosalind and her husband Jimmy, sharing and giving were simply practices of their faith, as much a part of their identity and personhood as their belief in Jesus and its call to kindness. Answering the call to kindness is not always easy, of course. Sometimes people will say cruel things about you or your family or your children. Sometimes they will criticize your choices or question your motives. The Carters got a full serving of that over their lifetimes, and it never stopped them from doing what was right. It never caused them to say, "But don't you know who we are?" It never once deterred them from what they saw as their God-given obligation to help others less fortunate than themselves. So now we come to the part of the sermon where I challenge you. You know I do this. And so the question I have is, what is it that you believe in so strongly that you are willing to endure the slings and arrows of small people to continue to do? What is it that you are morally bound to do, not because you get accolades, but because you feel like you've failed as a human being if you don't at least try? What is it that is so connected to your soul that it is, in fact, a spiritual practice? Generosity does not always mean giving money, although that is one way to be generous. Generosity as a spiritual practice is but one facet of the legacy that the Carters leave this world. Devotion to their God, commitment to family, humility in all they do, and generosity that begins deep in their hearts, not merely in their bank accounts. That is their legacy. For truly, the Carters could have stopped picking up hammers at Habitat for Humanity building projects decades ago, and no one would have faulted them. But they understood that they are not so grand and glorious that they can sit on boards and tell others what to do and think they've completed their task. They knew that it mattered when they showed up and did the humble work of nailing together 2x4s to make a home for a family that needed one. In an interesting aside, somewhere in the 1990s, the Carters sent home their Secret Service detail. As a former president and first lady, they are entitled to Secret Service protection for the rest of their days. The Secret Service, frankly, just got in the way and were no good at building houses. So they said, please go home. We're fine. And so for the past, I don't know how many decades, they have lived without Secret Service protection. I'm sure they have some sort of alarm system in their house, but they don't have burly guys with guns surrounding them all the time. I remember that it was truly the piece where they said they got in the way when they were trying to build things. But Rosalind and Jimmy Carter understood that it mattered when they showed up. When they showed up in rural places on the African continent to fight parasitic infections that ravaged remote communities, they didn't just send a check, although their foundation does plenty of check sending. They sent themselves as human emissaries of goodwill, of Christian service, of spiritual caring and generosity. We don't all need to be, nor could we possibly achieve, generosity at the same level as the Carters. It is rare people indeed that have the resources and situations available to them to do what the Carters have done. There are only so many ex-presidents. They are very clear, though, that Jimmy's political career was the springboard from which they were able to launch a worldwide effort to help people. But we, not being former governors or former presidents, can work at the places where we are. We can volunteer at the Takery. We can volunteer at the Arts Festival. We can show up at the church booth at a Pride celebration. We can volunteer to help make coffee or to clean up after a potluck, cough, cough, or to perform in the annual holiday service, also cough, cough. The Carters did what they did out of a deep, abiding faith in the message of Jesus of Nazareth. Our tradition, both Unitarian and Universalist, have their roots in that same theology, and it plays out every day. We believe that everyone has worth and dignity. That is solid Jesus of Nazareth stuff. We believe that we are obligated to support others, to be good stewards of the planet, and to care for each other. Again, if anyone tells you that we don't have a set of beliefs, I would argue that they are wrong. We believe things. We just happen to believe them because we have spent a great deal of time thinking and reasoning and reaching into our hearts to know what is right and just and compassionate. We know what is right and just and compassionate because it is in our souls, in our spirits, not simply because an ancient text tells us it is so. Rosalind Carter died this week after a lifetime of exemplary service to humanity. Her model is an inspiration to everyone. And we are human. We need not achieve the things that Rosalind Carter achieved through her generosity. We can work here in our communities to do what needs doing. When we make generosity a regular practice, it becomes a deeply spiritual thing. I offer you this morning an invitation to engage in spiritual generosity in your daily lives. Consider what you might be able to offer and do that. Don't worry about what you might be able to achieve or complete. Consider what you can give and how you can offer support. We're not talking about a goal here, we're talking about a process. And then do that thing. Make that step, that little trim tab sized thing, that little bite-sized piece of something that we can do on our way to a bigger thing. May our lives and our actions and our practices as spiritual beings in this space be as enriching to the world as they are to our hearts. May this be our practice and our prayer. Amen. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our closing hymn. It's number 300 in your gray hymnal, 300 in the gray, with heart and mind.